Good morning. What I plan on talking about today is I'm going to give a short lecture about the American Iron Triangle. This is an American political concept that is taught in all basic political science classes in the United States. And it's a concept that's central to understanding how the American political process works. Uh, American political process works. So I will begin by explaining the origin of the American Iron Triangle, then I will explain how it works in the present day, and lastly I will finish by explaining its effect on the current American political system and how it has an influence on discourse within the United States. So let's go ahead and get started with the origin of the American Iron Triangle. The Iron Triangle has its origin in the American Industrial Revolution, which occurred in the 1800s. Now, during this Industrial Revolution, there was a large flow of wealth towards the owners of the railways, the industries that employed most of the working class. There wasn't really much of a middle class in this scenario. So, since all the wealth flowed this way, most of these industrialists is the word, would then proceed by giving large political contributions to whoever would favor their cause within the government. It rarely mattered which political party. Also, they would tell their workers to vote a certain way in elections in order to control who won the election. So this is the basis of how they would. This is the basis of how they would create control over the political system. Now, this is best illustrated by a rather funny American political cartoon of the era that illustrates the U.S. Senate chamber, which has two entrances. One entrance is for the industrialists, and then the other entrance is for all of the general public. Now, these are compared. The American public's entrance is rather small, and there's a long single file line standing outside that has no hope of ever getting in, whereas the industrial entrance is large and grand. And you have all the American industrialists with various members of the U.S. Senate kowtowing and bowing to these industrialists. Now, as negative as this sounds, this was in fact the reality of it. Now, this Iron Triangle has continued into the present day, though it has become rather more formalized, may we say. It's not quite as corrupt and direct. It is a little more subtle than it was in those days. Now, most of the Iron Triangle consists of three branches. One point is the executive agencies, the bureaucrats that are responsible for carrying out the legislation that is pushed through Congress. The second point is the American legislature, which pushes through various pieces of legislation, which consists of members of Congress and their congressional staffs. Now, the third point, and also the most influential point, is lobbies within the United States. Now, the lobbies serve multiple roles within the system. For both the legislative branch and the executive branch, they'll help in the writing of pieces of legislation, since most of these members of Congress, their staffs, are quite busy actually conducting the business of government. Also, what these lobbies will do is they'll write this legislation, then they'll give it to the legislature, they'll give it to the bureaucrats, and they'll also supply the relevant policy research that they can then use to push this legislation within Congress and then get it passed. Now, there's a couple of examples for this. The first that I'll do is a foreign policy example. This is the Israel lobby within the U.S. government. Now, what the Israel lobby does is they support a large amount of monetary support so that pieces of legislation and American foreign policy will conduct it in the Middle East in a way that is favorable towards the interests of Israel. Whether you're in support of this or against this is irrelevant. They have a large base in the American population. There is a large part of the American population that tends to be in support of them, as neighbors or allies and the only voice of reason within the Middle East. Now, because of all of this influence that they have, they then can continue to supply a large amount of money to these electoral campaigns, which is how these organizations gain their influence. So they get these people elected, and then these people will continue to support their policies and provide policies which are generally beneficial to them. As you might guess, this has led to a generally negative perception of special interest groups within the media and within large parts of the American population. Uh, however, however, this is because most of this legislation tends not to support the general public and instead supports a small group. Now, this small piece of legislation might not be harmful to the rest of the American public, but it might not really be beneficial either. And the American populace might feel that their time in government is really being wasted by for these special interest groups. However, there's a great example that I can use to illustrate this, and that is environmental protection programs. Now, there are some environmental protection programs in the past that have been really beneficial. However, there is a large lobby based in the business world that believes that a lot of these environmental protection programs are not really that necessary because the environment is not really being hurt that much. Now, because of this, they then believe that that these environmental protection programs can be done away with in favor of expanding business and expanding industry and attracting jobs and economic benefits to the United States. While environmental groups have done a significant amount of work to catch up to this divide, they still haven't approached the strength that American industry has in favoring this legislation. So as it stands now, they can't really catch up. But there is a flip side to this. It shows that even the fact that there is legislation that does exist and that does favor the environment, according to these groups, shows that any group which has a large amount of money and has a large amount of voter support can then proceed to gain influence within the American political system. So there's groups such as the AARP, which might not have as much money, but do have a large amount of people who vote in elections that can then leverage a large amount of the support to create policies that are beneficial for the United States. Examples of this include Medicare, which provides health insurance to the elderly over the age of 65. So while we can say that it could be negative, special interest groups could be negative, we can say that they are here to stay. The Iron Triangle, as a result, is here to stay. And then and that any group can become involved in the Iron Triangle with a significant form of leverage that they can then use. I yield the rest of my time to questions.